I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 183rd episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to help the better workings of your own brain, up to and including helping it to overflow with electrical charge in the service of learning, which is kind of what's going on actually when you do trans-Cranial direct current stimulation, also known as tDCS. We've had a couple of episodes previously talking about tDCS, but this time we're going to be looking at it from a slightly different angle or for a slightly different application, which is the use of tDCS on the motor cortex of the brain, so helping with physical movements of skeletal muscles, and in this case, the application to sports performance and actually really any physical skill. I'm going to be talking with one of the co-founders of the company Halo Neuroscience, Dr. Daniel Chao, a medical doctor and technologist. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, keeping it physical in the ruthless listener retention gimmick, we're going to be talking about how musical performers, when they make a physical commitment to the music they're performing, they actually wind up appreciating the music more. We'll make you hang around until the very end of the episode for that, but right now, let's kick things off, as usual, with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So it's relatively well known that taking naps is good for a person's cognition, and studies have shown that brief naps, even just 10 minutes or so, can lead to greater alertness and greater accuracy and speed when performing numeric processing and cognitive tasks. But one thing there has not been a lot of is comparative studies of different nap lengths and trying to find the optimum duration of a nap to get the most bang for your buck cognitively. A recent analysis conducted in China based on the China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study looked at some 3,000 adults aged 65 and older, many of whom, almost 60%, reported taking post-lunch naps of various durations. This was a questionnaire-based study where they answered questions on their napping habits and demographic questions, cognitive questions, their level of mood or depression, their social activities, and their nighttime sleep duration, and looking at how these things varied based on their nap time duration if they took naps. They broke the population down into 4 groups categorized as non-nappers, short nappers. Short nappers were taking naps of less than 30 minutes, moderate nappers whose naps were 30 to 90 minutes, and extended nappers who had naps of greater than 90 minutes. They found statistically significant differences in cognitive performance based on each of these groups, many of these correlations having very strong statistical significance, a p-score of less than 0.001. Typically, a p-score of just 0.05 is enough to say that something is not attributable to chance, so 0.001 is pretty much a slam dunk for being a meaningful correlation. The results, according to this study, were that the moderate nappers, people that napped in that 30 to 90 minute range, performed better cognitively than any of the other groups. The non-nappers had poorer cognition than the short nappers, and both the short nappers and the extended nappers, the people that went over 90 minutes, each had poorer cognition than the moderate nappers. As mentioned, the people in the study were 65 years old, so pretty old folks, and there were enough people in the study where they were able to get sort of a cognitive snapshot of what might be expected for a person at a certain age. Based on those data and being cross-compared to how the nappers performed, taking one of these mid-range naps was basically akin to having a brain 5 years younger in terms of the cognitive performance. So 5 years, not necessarily a huge difference if you're 65, but still not a bad finding. One thing that was not covered in the study, which would be really nice to know, is how long the study subjects had been napping in the way that they were napping at the time that they filled out the questionnaire. So you're 65, maybe you've been taking your 1 hour after lunch naps for the last year, but maybe that wasn't what you were doing for the first 64 years of your life. That would be worth knowing. This study doesn't address that question, but since naps are a pretty pleasant habit anyway, might not be a bad one to get started on early.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Chucky BW from the USA said, "Awesome info and commentary on nootropics. This podcast always has great content along with the newest research." And Meldef34 from the USA says, "I am riveted while listening and have had my sometimes conventional beliefs turned on their ear. Keep up the good work, Jesse and the team." Well, thank you very much. We will certainly endeavor to do so. Thanks to everybody that's been leaving reviews and spreading the Smart Drug Smarts word. Super helpful, very appreciated. I'm going to put out one more little call to action. If you're in the midst of a Smart Drug Smarts binge at the moment, if you're binge listening to episodes, we're trying to put a bit of a content tagging system on our past episodes, which now that we're up in the 180s, we've got a lot of episodes to go through. We've had a couple of people that have been helping, and really it's been hugely helpful getting some listener support in doing this, but we could probably use a couple more people. So if you happen to be in the midst of a Smart Drug Smarts binge and you don't mind answering a couple of yes-no questions following the listening to any given episode, that would be hugely appreciated. Let me know. Drop me me an email at jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com, and we'll see what we can do to pull you into the mix here. This will help with the Smart Drug Smarts website overhaul, which is currently going on behind the scenes. Got a lot of stuff percolating behind the scenes. One thing that's actually going to be coming up is I've finally set a date for the water fast that we're going to be doing for this year. Water Fast Week 2017 is going to be the second week of July. That's July 8th to the 14th, starting on a Saturday, ending on a Friday. A decent handful of people have already emailed me about getting involved there. People from past years I know might be interested. If you would like to join an online group of us doing the water fast and we haven't been in touch yet, then we've got a sign-up form that will be up by the time this episode goes live. That'll get you on an email list where I'll send you out more information, and that's going to be at smartdrugsmarts.com/waterfast, all one word. So you got just over a month to prepare for that if you so choose. We'll be talking more about that and the reasons behind it in the coming weeks, probably on the podcast and certainly in the Brain Breakfast newsletter. The Brain Breakfast is back in full swing. I think I'm 3 for 3 in the last 3 weeks actually getting that published on time. And I will dangle this little carrot. Definitely, if you have not signed up for the newsletter yet, I'm going to be having an announcement sometime coming soon, early part of the summer here. Something pretty cool that will be whipping the veil off. Probably let people on the newsletter know about that first. So if you are the type that is bedeviled by curiosity, you have to be the first to know. Don't say I didn't warn you. Now is your chance. Should you want to sign up for that, you can do so at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. Finally, last but not least, a reminder about Smart Drug Smarts retail operation over at axonlabs.io. We've got a couple of nootropic stacks over there, Nexus and Mitogen, 10 cognition-enhancing compounds packed into 2 supplements. Nexus is an aniracetam-based mix. Slightly stimulant from the CDP choline, benefits creativity and working memory thanks to the aniracetam, and even has an adaptogen compound called pycnogenol. You can find both Nexus and Mitogen over at axonlabs.io.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with Dr. Daniel Chao, who is the CEO of Halo Neuroscience. He's also a medical doctor, and this is actually his second company that he's created applying technology to human brains. As you will hear, his first company was an implantable device for dealing with epilepsy, which is out there and physically installed in thousands of people's brains at this point. For a lot of people, that might be enough to kind of hang up the neuroscience spurs and rest on one's laurels, but not Dr. Daniel Chao. He was back at it pretty much immediately, and Halo Neuroscience is his second foray. We're going to be talking primarily in this interview about something called Halo Sport, which is the first product that they've brought to market, something aimed at the consumer sphere, aimed at athletes. Halo Neuroscience has picked up a lot of press recently for their technology partnership with the San Francisco Giants baseball team, but as you will hear, could be applicable really to anybody trying to learn a physically based skill. This is a product built around applying tDCS technology to the brain's motor cortex, and a really interesting conversation that we're about to get into. We're going to be talking both about the science of tDCS and some of the legal hoops and market forces, why they decided to put this technology out in the way that they did, going into the market first with a sports performance-based product. The folks at Halo Neuroscience were nice enough to hook me up with a Halo Sport device to call my own, so I've been able to use this in my own workouts for the last couple of weeks. We talk about that a little in the coming interview, and I'll talk about it more after now that I've been using it longer. But for right now, let's dive in first with Dr. Daniel Chao.
In a lot of ways, it is not obvious why Halo Neuroscience is a sports performance company first. My co-founder and I were both brain stimulation guys, so specifically we're experts in using electricity to interface with the brain to enhance the brain's performance. Our last company, we built it's almost like an implantable computer for the brain to treat epilepsy. So that was a big project, 10 years of our life. We raised $250 million to get that through development and the FDA approval process. But I'm happy to report it's out there helping lots of people with epilepsy, which is a very difficult to treat disease with drugs. So it's great that we have this new mechanism to get at that. But, how we got to sports was first a belief in this technology that we came across. It's called trans-Cranial direct current stimulation. We believed in the data around its ability to affect the neurophysiology. We tried using this technology in a variety of different ways when we first founded Halo. The first thing we did is we read every paper and we started a path to replicating other people's data. For us, it's not enough that you published a paper. So the first thing we did is something that I think is very boring, but is necessary, and that is to replicate other people's experiments. And the research program where we found it the easiest to replicate other people's data was around stimulating the special part of the brain called the motor cortex. So this is the part of the brain that controls movement in our bodies to accelerate movement-based learning. So this is everything between fine motor control, like playing a piano keyboard or violin, so these very small, delicate movements, to gross motor control, which is like powerlifting, and everything in between. I think there's an understanding that there's a neurologic component to all of these movements, and we were able to very nicely show in our lab that we can get a statistically significant result over a sham control group. And that's really when we started thinking about sports, who needs to move for a living, who really values movement, and that naturally led us to athletes.
One question right off the bat about the differences between fine motor control and something like powerlifter doing a squat. In thinking about learning, I think it's sort of intuitively obvious that a pianist needs to learn very particular movements, but a powerlifter, what is the motor cortex learning in that instance?
In a powerlifting movement, it's not one muscle group. It's dozens, if not 100 different muscles working in conjunction to create that movement. So there is skill to strength. Figuring out what is the correct sequencing and which muscles to fire is a skill that is optimized with practice. So that's one dimension. Another dimension is really just the raw electrical output that comes out of this cable called a nerve that is governed by your brain that fires the muscle. So it recruits motor units to generate this thing called a muscle contraction. That is also learned. And you can actually measure that electrically with an EMG electrode. You could put basically this postage stamp on your muscle and measure how electrified your muscle is. And you can follow that over time. A great example of what is the brain's role in strength is if we put anybody, Jesse, let's pick on you. If we put you on a strength training regimen, over the days and weeks, you will become stronger. And most people think you will become stronger because of this thing called muscle hypertrophy, this process of tearing down your muscles and building them back stronger. So that does happen, but it takes 3 weeks for those gains to be realized. And yet in the first 3 weeks, you got stronger. So what happened there? It's actually your brain figuring it out. On one side, it's the biomechanical skill of strength that you were learning. On the other side, it was also just the raw electrical output that comes out of your brain that fires the muscles that was becoming more robust. So when we talk to strength and conditioning coaches at the professional level or the Olympic level, they get this already. They understand there's a neurologic component to strength.
What do you see as far as comparing and contrasting the results for the explosivity power stuff versus more the fine motor control that a pianist or a ballerina or something like that would be getting?
Yeah, so there's ways to measure that scientifically. For fine motor control, we've used successfully an electronic piano keyboard connected to a computer. And the task there is to ask the subject to play different pressure combinations with their 5 fingers. So it's not finger combinations, which would be too easy. It's pressure combinations, which is actually quite difficult. And we just measure the time it takes to execute each one of these different tasks. And over time, you'll see the subject, as they practice and they get more training reps, this time to execute decrease. So you can measure the slope of the line, and that is a model for fine motor control and the learning thereof. So experimentally, what we can do is we can invite in a group of test subjects and we randomize them to either receive real neurostimulation or what we call sham neurostimulation, which feels like the real thing, but it actually doesn't work. None of the test subjects know which group they're in. The Halo research associate doesn't know which group any of the subjects are in. So it's a truly double-blinded so-called study. And then everybody does the same training. We do before and after testing, and we compare the results. And we can really nicely show that the Halo group does better than the control group. Full disclosure, the control group gets better. It's important for us to measure that because we need to be better than the control group.
Because they're practicing a skill also.
Yeah, exactly. And there's natural learning that happens. So it's not good enough for us to say like, oh, we helped you get better. That doesn't mean anything because you would have gotten better anyways on your own. We need to beat that control group. So that's fine motor control. Gross motor control is much easier. There are these force plates and strain gauges that you can measure. Grip strength is a good one that we like because it's also doesn't really expose the test subject to injury. Versus a squat, it's a more dangerous athletic movement. But for those that are skilled in powerlifting, we can do that in that cohort of people. But yeah, like gross motor control, there's a couple of different ways that we can look at that. One is called MVC, maximum voluntary contraction. There's force plates that we can use. It's like your wireless scale at home times 1,000. You can do vertical leap off a device like that. And we can measure how much force you produced in that movement. There's something called 2-rep max. We like 2-rep max because it's not as injury inducing as 1-rep max. So yeah, there's these different ways of testing gross motor control, which tends to be a lot easier from a measurement perspective than testing fine motor control.
And what do you see as far as the magnitude of the differences between the sham group and the group that you put on the Halo?
It depends. Let me answer this two ways. Depends on your level of training and how much distance there is between where you are today and your genetic potential. For people who are relatively untrained, there's a lot of dynamic range for us to work with. And we can show a statistically significant change in performance in literally a single session. And this is in excess of a control group. We can show this motor learning happens probably a full third faster than a control group. So these are untrained individuals. So now let's change the story and talk about elite athletes. So these are people who have been training every day of their life for 10 years or more. The distance between where they are and their genetic potential is razor thin. But at their level, 1% makes a difference. Like if we helped a marathoner become 1% more efficient, more biomechanically efficient, that person just won. The gains in a relative sense may not seem as impressive as the results that we get in untrained individuals. And also the time to get those gains is longer. So what we can do in a single session in untrained individuals takes several weeks at the elite level. But that's okay. We're happy with that. If the gains are smaller and they take longer in elite athletes, they don't mind.
You mentioned there that the sham treatment as opposed to the halo treatment, that they feel the same perceptually to the person wearing it. Can you explain what that feeling is actually, how it feels to wear one of these things?
What we hear most of the time, it's like a tingling sensation. Some people call it a mild sensation of heat. Some people call it pinpricks. So we get a lot of different things, but I'd say a good 2/3 of people call it tingling.
I'm suspecting that a lot of people might not be able to picture exactly where the motor cortex is in relation to the overall brain and skull. We're obviously a little bit limited by the podcast medium here, but can you try to explain where the motor cortex can be found?
The motor cortex exists in what's called a strip. Motor cortex is also called the motor strip. That exists basically right above your ears. So it goes ear to ear and over the top of your head. Any set of headphones, the arch of the headphone pretty naturally goes over the motor cortex, which is really lucky piece of neuroanatomy for us. That's how we were able to adopt the headphone form factor and build what we call primers into the underside of the arch of our headset.
The videos on the Halo Neuroscience website show a lot of vigorous physical athletic activity going on with people actually wearing the Halo. Some things you could imagine, 100 jumping jacks, you're probably going to at least lose the good points of contact if the Halo doesn't fly off entirely. Can you tell us a little about the priming of the brain using the Halo versus the actual workout itself, and how much of a time delay there is in the period after the priming where the motor cortex is really prepped to learn?
Maybe I'll take a step back and explain what the neurostimulation is actually doing, in this case to the motor cortex, and then we'll talk about the application and the timing. 20 minutes of this form of neurostimulation will put the underlying brain region into a temporary state of what neuroscientists call hyperplasticity. And this temporary state lasts for about an hour. So as you might remember from Neuroscience 101, neuroplasticity is the process by which our brain creates new circuits in our brain. This is a process that is more robust when we're young, and it starts to decline in our teens. But importantly, it never goes to zero. This old adage, you're never too old to learn, that is true. How can we tease out this process of neuroplasticity and basically make your brain temporarily kid-like? We can do this with neurostimulation. So we need about 20 minutes, and you need to apply it to a specific brain region that you want to train. So in the case of Halo Sport for athletes, we're targeting the motor cortex. And what we want to do, we want the athlete to apply this 20 minutes of neurostimulation before their training session. So we call this neuro priming. So you're almost priming your brain for a workout. Usually that ties in really nicely with your warm-up, which is about 20 minutes anyways. So like stretching and warming up, usually that goes for 20 minutes. Our ask to the athlete is to wear Halo Sport during that time such that when your body's warmed up, your brain is as well. And then both sides, brain and body, is prepared for your athletic training.
And as far as what's actually happening with the application of electricity through the scalp in this case, essentially you're souping up different areas of the brain with some extra electric charge, which if you think of a neuron as being like a gun ready to fire, you're making the trigger a little bit looser, easier to pull that trigger when the stimulation from the next neuron up the chain comes down.
That's a great analogy. So firing the gun in your analogy is firing an action potential for a neuron. Essentially, what this neurostimulation is doing is just making it like we're pulling the trigger 15%, call it. You still have to do the other 85%. That's important. That's why we really recommend that you do athletic training right after your neurostimulation session. Like if you were to sit on the couch, nothing would happen. So you still have to do the work and pull the rest of the trigger.
Let me just ask the dark side question here is if you went through your priming period and then you did sit on the couch eating Doritos for an hour, would you inadvertently be training yourself to be good at sitting on your ass for an hour?
You'd get better at eating Doritos. The other dark side question is like, what if I had a bad training day? And yeah, that's a risk. The brain is agnostic to the reps that you feed the brain. If there were bad reps, like poor technique, then it would be learned faster as well.
Would that be true even in the face of negative stimulation of like you recognize things don't work well and you kind of get that negative feedback, whether that's emotional feedback or some other form? Isn't learning sort of self-regulating in that way?
A lot of learning, motor learning included, is really error-based, like you recognizing what worked and what didn't, and recognizing the errors especially, and coding a negative emotional reaction to it so that you try not to do it again. So a lot of these principles are already pre-baked into the way the motor system learns, so we just kind of plug straight into those systems. So let's say you were working out, you had a coaching session, and the coach didn't really know what they were doing, and they were teaching you bad technique. You might learn bad technique faster that day, but it's not like the wheels are going to come off and you're going to be forever ruined as an athlete. Even with neurostimulation, learning happens fairly slowly, so there's plenty of time to recover from a session like that.
Would this be something that would be safe and useful for kid athletes? I mean, is there like a younger age that you wouldn't want to use technologies like this on?
Okay, so 18 and over there is some cover your ass lawyer stuff there, but there is some neuroscience, and that is the thickness of your skull. We account for an adult level skull thickness. So we've developed the technology with a certain level of intensity, amplitude of the electric field that we produce that assumes an adult skull. Now, let's say you were 6 years old and you had crazy parents that were pushing you to do something and wanted you to learn sports faster. The skull thickness is not nearly at an adult level. And so a 6-year-old's brain would get more amplitude than what we would feel comfortable with. You know, the skull, there's an amount of resistivity to it. So the level of amplitude that we provide from an electric field standpoint is strong enough to get through that resistivity. Now, if your skull isn't full thickness, then just a lot more current gets to the brain, and we should caution against that.
When you were looking at the replication data for the tDCS studies, and that's where you saw the best results replicating the positive studies in the motor cortex, you've taken this in the direction of an offering for athletics, but one of the other directions that you might have gone is more the physical rehab if somebody is recovering from a stroke or other injury. I imagine once again that's motor cortex centric learning that needs to happen there. Is that something you're pursuing or that might be in the offing?
Man, thanks for asking that, Jesse. So I'm actually a medical doctor by training. Went to Stanford Medical School and master's in neuroscience. And my last company was this very serious medical device company. So this is actually the heritage of the company. Like, I'm not an expert in consumer electronics. I'm an expert in medical devices. And we actually founded the company to be a medical device company. Something happened in our first year of operation where the FDA said, hey, we realize this technology is out there, and if you market it for consumer applications, so if you specifically don't market it for treating a disease, we'll consider this a health and wellness device, and you can sell it. You know, that day the company changed from a medical device company first to a consumer electronics company first. So strategically, from a business perspective, we're like, well, we've got the green light, we've got our product, let's sell it to consumers for consumer applications first. In the meantime, a parallel track that just takes longer, let's test it in a disease model. And it's great that you mentioned stroke rehab. We already have a clinical trial that's about half enrolled looking at motor stroke rehab. So to the same extent we can help an elite athlete with their athletic training, it really begs the question, could we help a stroke victim with his or her physical therapy? It's the same principles of inducing these states of hyperplasticity and then pairing whatever movement-based training, whether it's athletic training or physical therapy. You mentioned post-injury. I think that's a great application for this. So let's say an athlete tears an ACL or rotator cuff, any of these sports injuries, there's a necessary period of disuse that's required to allow the surgery to heal and the swelling in the joint to go down and this kind of thing. Now, we can see the atrophy that disuse in parts on the body by just looking at the muscles around the affected joint. In an ACL, you can see your quads literally just shrink almost before your very eyes. What you can't see is the atrophy in the brain. The brain is a territorial organ. Brain areas that are more highly active get more real estate in the cortex. Brain areas that aren't being used are literally invaded by their neighbors who are more active and give up that space. So you can imagine that the representation of controlling the knee in an ACL situation, for example, has literally gotten smaller. We can't see it, but it's happening. This is actually part of plasticity. A lot of it happens in this pathological state where the brain unnecessarily consumes a part of useful brain that you might need down the line. So you almost want to tell your brain, it's like, hey, leave that alone for a second. My knee is healing. It's going to be fine in a month. Just leave it alone. But it doesn't happen that way. So what can we do to remodel that part of the brain so that we can take back that area?
There have been those really interesting studies in visualization where they've shown that if somebody is on crutches for a month or whatever, but they want to be able to maintain their performance, or at least at some level, like not atrophy as quickly as they otherwise might, people can visualize physical movements and that their brain does some significant percent of the learning that they might do if they were actually physically enacting those movements. I'm wondering if you're strapping the halo on during visualizations, if there's an additive effect that the halo might be able to bring.
Jesse, you just nailed my pet project. I love that idea for a couple of reasons. Like, we think about visualization of the motor system. You throw someone into an MRI scanner and you have them, visualize their golf swing or three-point shot. Their motor cortex is going crazy. What if we paired visualization of a motor task with stimulation of the motor cortex? There's no data that I've been able to find that supports that this works or not. It hasn't been tried to my knowledge. I would love to try it. When we think about athletic training, and especially in sports that are physical, like professional football, practice is limiting. There's only so many reps that, say, a professional football player can impart on their body before the fatigue curve catches up to the performance curve. Also, when you're talking about really physical repetitions, there's a risk of injury. So practice is not free, and practice is precious. There's only so much practice that you're allowed. So with neurostimulation, do we have an opportunity to make physical practice more efficient? I think we do. But what about mental practice? Like, this gets at your question around visualization. Like, are those free physical reps that we can do just mentally?
Is there the potential for almost an inverted halo? Like, if I know that I'm going to be sitting in a movie theater for the next 3 hours watching the next Lord of the Rings, doing nothing physical, there's nothing worth learning going on except how to move popcorn to my mouth, would it be worth wearing something like the halo that is making my motor cortex less souped up?
Yes, let's talk about the polarity of the electrodes. To complete a circuit, we need a positive and a negative. The so-called anode, this goes way back 15 years ago when this field was first founded. It was thought that the anode is activating and the cathode is inhibiting. Since then, there's been sort of a change in opinion in the field, and that is both polarities are activating, just the anode is more activating. So I'm afraid we don't have that chill out stimulation for you, Jesse, like when you're hanging out eating popcorn where you just want to chill your motor system out. So I don't think we're there yet.
Gotcha. If I'm an 18-year-old pianist and I just got accepted to Juilliard or whatever, is there any reason why I wouldn't be using the exact same thing to practice my piano skills?
This is a fantastic question. The company is Halo Neuroscience, so we're broader than sports at a company level, but our first product is Halo Sport. And we think of, say, musicians as athletes as well. So we think of athletes in a broader perspective. What a violinist needs to do is very akin to what a basketball player needs to do. It's all movement-based training. From a marketing perspective, the company has purposely decided to limit our marketing messaging to traditional sports. We believe that there are these so-called adjacent verticals to traditional sports that Halo Sport will certainly work. First and foremost, it's musicians. 10% of our sales go to musicians without us doing anything for this community. We haven't spoken to this community formally at all. At some point where our marketing and the understanding around traditional sports is kind of hardened and people get that, we'll start talking about other applications. So we're also really excited about gaming, competitive video gamers. You've ever watched a video gamer where they do a close-up on their hands. It's insane. The military is our biggest customer already. About to start working with our first commercial airline, and this is for pilot training. I didn't know this, but it's a crazy mental backflip to go from Airbus to Boeing. The dials and switches are in all the wrong places. Even the control stick is completely different. On one side, on Boeing, it's a pretty big control stick that has tactile feel, so it pushes back on you, versus for Airbus, it's this joystick that's really small. It's almost like a toothpick, which is kind of scary. And there's no tactile feel, and you control it with your left hand if you're sitting in the pilot seat. Also, going from the co-pilot seat to the pilot seat is like driving in the US and then driving in England. Everything is flipped backwards. So how can we help with accelerate the movement-based learning with pilots? That's something that we're really excited to do as well.
There are other tDCS devices on the market that seem to be more overtly aiming at cognitive enhancement rather than motor cortex enhancement. Do you guys see Halo getting into that in the future, or is there a reason you didn't? What are some of the differences there?
Yeah, so there's nothing that says that we couldn't scale our technology, and that is move the electrode to hit a different brain target. So right now, Halo Sport's our only product, and that's a Motor Cortex neurostimulator. But what if we were to reskin the form factor so that we target the electrode to a different brain region? So yeah, there's definitely an interest for us to get into that. The next logical place, without spilling the beans from a company secrets perspective, is to move the electrode more frontal, to get at more cognitive function. Let you guys openly hypothesize as to what we can get at there. But yeah, you could definitely look forward for us to ship different products in the months and years to come.
I'll flip that question a little bit. As I understand it, the visual processing areas of the brain are more towards the back of the head. If you were to soup up those areas a bit, has there been any changes in a person's visual acuity or ability to see through optical illusions or anything like that?
There's visual training exercises that actually sharpen your visual acuity by not doing anything to the front end. Your cornea and your lens and your optic nerve are all the same. But what if we could soup up the processor? So it's almost like the NVIDIA graphics card that you have in your computer. What if we could take the same information but help the processor? So yeah, like what if we move the electrode to the occipital lobe to get at visual cortex? There's already experiments that show that if you train the eye with these patches, these like contrast patches, you can look at, and it takes a long time. It takes months to really develop enhanced visual processing to get at acuity. But yeah, there's already scientific evidence that shows that we can soup up the visual processor to enhance visual acuity. Say, for example, like getting back to sports, if you're a baseball player, most baseball players have 20/20 vision and get LASIK to get to like 20/10.
So they can read the spin on the seams of the baseball as it's coming at them. It's interesting. It seems like a lot of times when we're talking about cognitive optimization, we're thinking about processing the data once it's already there in our heads. But anything we can do to dial up the perceptual system to get better data in, that just gives us better information to work with.
Yeah, 100%. Think about military or police activities where they make decisions on what they see with very serious consequences. If we could help with the front end of that decision-making process, whether it be visual or auditory or the final output, that is the motor program. This is all, I think, the next evolution, human performance and neural performance. I like to compare where we are today in the history of this technology as to where Henry Ford was with the car. We have something amazing, it's new, and it's going to add incredible value to humanity today. Will we learn and get better? Absolutely. If we just have fun and fast forward a decade from now, do we have the opportunity to create, say, a helmet form factor? Right now, Halo Sport has only 3 electrodes. What if there was an array of 1,000 electrodes? Right now, Halo Sport only delivers neurostimulation. What if each one of those electrodes not only delivered neurostimulation, but also did sensing? Do we have the opportunity to really close the loop, monitor the brain, and then deliver neurostimulation based on what it sees, and then also very task specific? If you can tell your helmet, it's like, all right, I'm going to the library and I need to learn math. Okay, helmet, adapt for me in this situation so that I can learn math faster. Or I'm going to study Duolingo on my phone to learn Italian. The helmet will automatically stimulate language cortex. So yeah, it's fun to think about the future and where we can take this.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very, very much to Dr. Daniel Chao for taking the time for that conversation. I found that extremely interesting, and it's easy to forget that when it comes to muscle behavior, the strength of the muscle itself and also the strength of the electrical signal causing that movement, those are dissociable things, and a weakness in either one leads to overall weakness in the resulting movement. When you hear about these situations where a tree falls on a kid and suddenly a 5'1" woman lifts up a tree to pull the baby out from under, you think, how the heck does that happen? It probably has a lot to do with the strength of the signal at that point being sent to her muscle, rather than what her muscles might be able to do on an average day with her unexcited. Pretty much no sooner was that conversation over that I sent an email to Dr. Chao and asked if I could get connected with his co-founder in Halo Neuroscience, who we're going to be talking with on a separate episode, talking more about their previous company with the implantable device for epileptics. So something to look forward to later on in a future episode. So as for my own experience using the Halo, which I've been doing for the last couple of weeks now, I didn't have a huge amount of data on how my physical performance was prior to getting the Halo. So there wasn't really much of a data set to compare against, and I've also been lazy, therefore, about gathering exact quantifiable data since I've been using the Halo. Numbers aside, I'll tell you what I've noticed subjectively. First of all, as far as sort of the comfort factor of wearing the thing, I'll put a picture of me wearing it up on the web post for this episode, so smartdrugsmarts.com/183. You can also see a mazillion pictures by professional photographers and videos up at haloneuro.com. But it's got a good, solid feel to it, as you would expect if it's going to be worn by professional football, baseball players. Kind of looks and feels like an industrial strength set of over-the-ear headphones. And while you wear it during the 20-minute pre-training period while you're getting your brain charged up, there is sort of a light pain. I mean, it doesn't really hurt, but it's maybe akin to the pain that you would have if you had a cut and then you got into a chlorinated swimming pool. So it's not going to make you scream or cry, but just a little twinge of pain right over the crown of your head, which is where the 3 electrodes touch. You've got an app running during that time. It's giving you a countdown. You could be doing a warm-up in that time, and then at the end of the 20 minutes, you go into whatever workout you were doing. You've got 1 hour where your brain's in this hyperplastic period. And the two things I've noticed, one is sort of subjective, and the other is something which is definitely real, but the Halo can't probably take direct credit for it. The first one is that probably for the first 5 to 10 minutes of the workout, I do feel stronger than I do if I'm doing the same exercises. If I go out for a run, I feel springier in my step for the first half mile or so. If I'm lifting weights, the first couple of sets feel less effortful than they normally might. So that's one thing that's subjective, but I would definitely attribute it to the Halo. The second thing is, under normal circumstances, left to my own devices, I would never work out for a full hour. 20 to 40 minutes maybe, but an hour, no. But since having this conversation and being aware that my brain is in this hyperplastic state for an hour, and that if I'm doing the wrong thing, if I'm sitting at my laptop but not doing anything physical, I might be mistraining my brain to be a couch potato. Since being aware of that, when I do a Halo workout, I always make sure that I do go a full hour and I'm putting out effort during that whole time. So on the one hand, you could say that doesn't have anything to do with the tDCS directly, but it definitely is a result of my using the Halo and being aware of that 1 hour hyperplasticity period. Anybody that works out probably realizes that sometimes there's just little mental games that you play on yourself to get yourself to do the work. And so if using the Halo gives me a way to ratchet myself into doing an extra 20 or 30 minutes more work per workout, then that's a pretty good thing. Anyway, so that is all for our Halo sport coverage, but not all the physicality that we have in this episode. Something else physical coming at you next in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So if you've ever bought IKEA furniture that you've assembled yourself and then found yourself moving, maybe you're making a long move between states, and you find yourself bringing along some stupid piece of furniture that you built yourself that it would probably be cheaper just to buy a new one in the new place that you're moving to, but because you built it yourself, there's a certain pride of ownership or pride of creation that far exceeds the actual value of the piece of furniture. And this psychological concept seems to apply to a lot of things, kind of the value add of having physically created something yourself, or at least participated in the creation of it. And researchers in Germany at the Max Planck Institute for Human and Cognitive Brain Sciences were wondering if this fact could be used to their advantage in trying to find more effective ways of doing music therapy for relaxation and dealing with anxiety. In theory, this can be nice when it works. You don't have to worry about drug interactions or addiction or anything else because it's just music. The problem being that people's musical tastes vary quite a bit, and the aesthetics of a person's subjective musical choices can make it hard to fine-tune a musical prescription. But the researchers had reason to believe that physically performing music made it more likable to the performers than music that they were receiving passively. Musicians are often familiar with the phenomenon of liking their music more as they perform it than when they hear it played back to them on a recording. And now in these new experiments, the data seems to show that there's something about the athleticism of music making that actually makes the music performers enjoy their own music more. The researchers measured the effect of this positivity bias with something called gymmin, which is a combination of gym, like a gymnasium, and jammin', like what musicians do. Imagine a gym where you have things like abdominal trainers and steppers and pull bars and all that stuff hooked up to musical synthesizers that synthesize tones based on physical movements of those machines. So your bench press becomes a trombone or something like that. Says Thomas H. Fritz, one of the researchers. People who deem themselves totally unmusical and who have never held a musical instrument in their hands are thereby able to make music. When this occurs in combination with physical exertion, we can measure the positivity bias. They did this study in two groups receiving musical therapy. One was people recovering from drug addiction and the other were people with chronic pain issues. These people feel agitated by every little thing and easily become irritable. But by physically exerting themselves to make music, the style of music they performed actually becomes less important. These findings also seem to finally shed light on why 3-year-olds like using pianos as percussion instruments and just banging their hands on the keys, something which I assume everybody has been aggravated by at one point or another.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so you heard it. That was all for episode number 183. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you enjoyed this episode, you will find everything about it up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/183. Unsurprisingly, /182 will get you to last week's episode where I spoke with Dr. James McGaugh about memory. And next week in episode number 184, we're getting back to our roots with a good old episode about a chemical substance, something called theacrine, a kissing chemical cousin of caffeine. So until then, have a good first week of June. Catch you back here soon, next Friday, or possibly even sooner. Same time, same podcast, and with that same unwavering commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.